who's a leader in the library community, the head of the whole thing, springing from Baltimore, Maryland, and now the head of the Library of Congress, Carla Hayden. Thank you, Carla.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker and Senator Schumer, and all the members of Congress who are here in person and with us online. And as a librarian, a career librarian, who has spent her life working with bringing narratives to people, it is an honor for me to be with two of the leading and most distinguished historians.
Thank you.
I think we should all clap for that one.
Thank you.
This is a librarian's dream and everyone's dream, because you have both written and studied about the narrative of this country and some of the darkest times, some of the times that were triumphant. And as the Madam Speaker quoted from the song from Hamilton, if we lay a strong enough foundation, we'll pass it on to you. So I thought, could we travel back in time to the founding of this country? And were they sure? Did they know? What was going on then?
You want me to go? Because being described as a distinguished historian, as Doris and I know, is like being the best restaurant in the hospital. You want to win, but it's not that hard. But we're very grateful. And thank you to Madam Speaker and Senator Schumer. I think they would be surprised that we've come this far. They were incredibly aware of the fragility of democracy. They were aware of the fallibility of humankind. They had a keen awareness of sin and imperfection and appetite and ambition. They knew that the struggle in everyone's soul, which would find full expression in a popular government, was between generosity and greed, and between kindness and cruelty. And the goal of the Constitution was, yes, there were checks and balances in a literal sense, but it was also about curbing our worst instincts, to give, as the Speaker quoted earlier, to give our better angels a chance to take flight. Now, Doris is a better person than I am, as is Dr. Hayden, and we won't even get into Pelosi because she's so much better. But if I get things right 51% of the time, that's a heck of a good day. Why would a popular government be any different? Because a democracy is the manifestation of all of us. So our habits of heart and mind matter enormously. And what you saw a year ago today was the worst instincts of both human nature and American politics, which was the will to power over the idea of equality and the rule of law taking precedence. And without a recognition that this experiment is worth defending, this experiment is in fact, Jefferson called it the world's best hope in his inaugural, President Lincoln called it the last best hope, President Reagan called it the last best hope of man on earth. Without a defense of that idea, and what that idea is that in fact we are all created equal. And we are entitled to equal protection of the law, equal dignity, innate dignity. And without defending that idea, then we slip into a state of chaos. And what Doris and I are lucky enough to do is to find examples where those better angels have prevailed. And it's always a close run thing, right? There's never a landslide for the good guys. There's just not. Moses said, remember the days of old, remember the years of many generations, ask thy fathers and they will tell thee, thy elders and they will show thee. Gospel of St. John said, ye shall know the truth and the truth shall make ye free. And what does truth mean in Greek? It means unconcealed. There is a fact, there is a truth, and that when the scales fall from our eyes, there is a reality. And the reality of American life is that we have to defend this experiment.
Doris, you have written about the moment that George Washington at the founding, and he had an opportunity to become a different figure than we know him.
You know, I mean, it's really interesting, I think, when you think about George Washington and what might have happened to this country. All he had to do after the revolution was won was to take power, which many people wanted him to do. There was, in fact, a mutiny before when the soldiers weren't being paid. Hold on a second. And they said to him, you've got to take over, we need that. It would have been so easy for him to have a coup, but he didn't. And that's when old George III in Hamilton said, if he really went back to Mount Vernon and resigned his commissionership, which he did, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And that's what he was. And then he becomes president of the United States, and he clearly could have had 3 terms, 4 terms, 5 terms, but he voluntarily decided there was an importance for the peaceful transition of power. And then what does he do when he leaves? He leaves us with that farewell address, which gives us such warnings today, which I know they read in the Senate every year, and it just talked about the baneful effects of party strife, which was just beginning to show its head. And he understood that if that happened, and people in different parts of the country began to see each other, not through their mutual affections, but through almost their lust for power and their desire to somehow abuse it at times, then the whole experiment would fall apart. And then I just sometimes think about how you say how we didn't know what we were doing then. I remember when I was first giving a lecture at Harvard on the presidency, and I found the wonderful quotes about what we might call the president. At one point it might have been his mightiness, or it could have been his excellency, the protector of their liberties. And then Jefferson, I think, is the one who said, no, it should be Mr. President. And then Adams was apoplectic. There are presidents of garden clubs. There are presidents of Rotary clubs. There'll be no dignity. Without thrones, without dignity, the whole thing will fall apart. But of course, Mr. President, it became. So I think we look back on these things and we know it worked out. I mean, I keep thinking as an historian that the interesting thing is that we know what the people living at the time did not know. We know the revolution was won. We know George Washington became a president, not a military leader. We know that the Civil War ended with emancipation secured and the Union restored. We know that the Allies won World War II. But the people living through that time did not know that. So they're living with the same anxiety we're living through today. How will this fragile democracy, which is under attack today, resolve itself? And I guess the hope that that brings is that we've come through these really tough times before. And the hope is also that we're going to get to write the chapter of our story, just like our ancestors wrote the chapters of those stories. And they did pretty well. They failed us at times. But as you say, even though there's these bad angels, we've had extraordinarily good angels. Even on January 6th, as the speaker said, look at those people, those first responders. Look at the Capitol Police. Look at the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, the people in the Civil War. We've had lots of people who were willing to step up and put their public lives against their private lives. And that's what we've got to depend on today. That's what we need in these years and months ahead.
Now, both of you, though, have found some very chilling parallels between the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War, and our situation. So could we go back to that tumultuous decade and share what transpired and what was going on?
Well, the 1850s didn't end well, and so it is a chilling parallel. You had two competing visions of reality. You had two faiths. You had two interpretations of Scripture, both religious Scripture and secular Scripture, the Declaration of Independence. You had violence on the floor of the House. What you did not have was an insurrection, like the one you are commemorating today. On February 14th, 1861, when John Breckinridge, who had lost the presidency, along with Stephen Douglas, to Abraham Lincoln, was under pressure to decertify the electoral votes, he refused to do so. And Winfield Scott had fortified, and in fact, this experiment in liberty went on exactly 2 more months before Fort Sumter. 8 weeks before Fort Sumter, there was a plot to try to decertify the electoral count. Now, as Mark Twain once said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The issue, I think, about the 1850s heading into that is that you did not have a common story. There was not a sense that we were all devoted to what became the most important sentence ever originally rendered in English, which is that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. An amazing sentence that has changed more lives around the world than any other single sentence. And it was written not in a vacuum, but as part of this remarkable experiment that we were part of and are part of, which was an entire reorientation of reality when you think about it, from popes and princes and prelates and kings who were given authority over all of us. It was a vertical universe. Then what happened? We got Gutenberg. You got to love a conversation where Gutenberg comes up, just as a basic rule.
We nerds bring up
Yeah, exactly. This is like dork porn right now. You got Gutenberg, the Protestant Reformations, the spread of literacy, the scientific revolution, the Scottish moral enlightenment, the European enlightenment, an entire shift in the world from being organized this way to being organized this way, where we, in fact, were given the power to determine our own destinies. And the American Revolution, for all of its flaws, was the fullest political manifestation of that shift in reality. That's the idea. That's why soldiers were hitting Omaha Beach. That's what drove the women of Seneca Falls. That's what drove John Lewis and Hosea Williams and so many other people across that bridge. It was that there is an idea worth defending. And if enough of us do not assent to that idea, then madness comes. And the task of any generation, as Doris was saying, the task of any citizenry, the task of any Congress, is to remind people that, in fact, in diversity, there's strength. And it's always a close-run thing. It's not going to be easy. But it has worked before, and it should be able to work now.
Well, I think the chilling thing about the 1850s is when I think of the attack on Senator Sumner, the anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts, by Preston Brooks, the South Carolinian congressman, it happened in the Senate, and because of that, it touched, as one historian said, the hearts and minds of the American people in a way. Lots of other anti-slavery people had been attacked before, but somehow it hit home. And there was a sense in which, for a while, more people joined the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln joined it after that. The moderates and conservatives realized they had to leave the party structure behind. The Whig Party collapsed. And I thought that was going to happen, that a line had been drawn after January 6th in the same way. Because sometimes these events just touch you, and there's a fundamental sense on the part of the people that something had to change. And we got Abraham Lincoln out of that. The sad, scary part of the 1850s is that Preston Brooks became a hero in the South. That the governor presented him with a silver goblet. People are running around with canes wanting to get other members of the anti-slavery movement. They'll get Seward next, they said. And it was part of that partisanship of the 1850s where you had alternative realities. Indeed, one historian said when you saw that event and you saw 2 alternative narratives, that's when you knew that something was happening to the country. And there's a sense, of course, that there was a partisan press in the 1850s. You know, when Lincoln would be in his debates with Stephen Douglas, and the Republican paper would be reporting on the very same debate that the Democratic Party would be reporting on. When they report on the Lincoln part of it, they say he was so triumphant, he was carried out on the arms of his supporters. You read the Democratic paper, and he fell on the floor. It was so embarrassing that he had to be dragged out by his supporters. So we have some of those parallels from the 1850s. And the only hope will be that, you're right, it ended badly. I mean, obviously it ended badly with the Civil War, but out of that came what had to be done, which was to undo that original sin of slavery. And those people fought for that. We had a leader in Abraham Lincoln who carried us through that. And I think when we look at what happened, that's what you have to remember, that somehow some of these fights have to be fought. But hopefully it doesn't have to end up that way, that we'll know the mistakes we made in the 1850s. You could see the country moving apart. Each one of those events, Kansas, Nebraska, Dred Scott decision, John Brown, it pulled us further and further apart so that there was no talking to one another on either side. We can't let that happen today.
If I may, and we have to incentivize this, right? We can't just preach at people. You have to find a way to make it in their interest to do the right thing. I wish that were different, but it's not. It hasn't been since Eden. Not our fault. So how do you do that? And I'd argue that one idea is history itself. What do you want the world to say of you? Do you want to be Bull Connor? Or do you want to be John Robert Lewis? Do you want to be Jefferson Davis? Or do you want to be Abraham Lincoln? Use the power of memory as an incentive, not as a bludgeon, but remind people that when we're at our best, we don't build statues to people who tear down. We build statues to people who create. I sometimes use what I call the portrait test. I sometimes say when I'm lucky enough to talk to people who hold office, what do you want us to think about when we look at your portrait? And it tends to work because y'all tend to think that people are going to be looking at your portrait, right?
Yeah.
And yours, ma'am. Yours.
Well, there was another time, the
Bubblehead.
turn of the 20th century. And you've written, Doris, about Teddy Roosevelt. And he was thrust into office after his assassination, President McKinley. And we don't often focus on that, but there were some similarities there.
Yeah, I think in many ways that the turn of the 20th century has more echoes for today than almost any other time. I mean, just think about it. The Industrial Revolution had shaken up the economy, much like globalization and the tech revolution have done today. It was the first time you really had a gap between the rich and the poor. You had people in the country feeling suspicious of all those people in the city. You had a sense of lots of immigrants coming in from abroad and an anti-immigrant philosophy that was developing. You had a whole bunch of new inventions, the telephone and the telegraph, that made some people feel life is moving too fast. We've got to go back to an earlier way of life. And Teddy Roosevelt warned at that time that the real problem for democracy, the threat, would be if people began regarding each other as the other, rather than as common American citizens, if people in different sections had a class hatred for one another. So that he saw, I think, what we're feeling today, but what did he do about it? He argued that there should be a fundamental fairness in the country, a square deal for the rich and the poor. I don't know where my voice has gone. I've been talking too much.
Never.
No.
A square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker. And then he went around the country in a train, 6 weeks every spring, 6 weeks every... Can you still hear me even if I'm talking like this? I normally have a low voice, but now it's gotten really low. So anyway, 6 weeks in the spring, 6 weeks in the fall, and he gave the same message all across the country. And then as the train would go away, he would stand there waving for hours at people who had just come to see him on the railroad track because he was the president who was trying to get a common American spirit going. And at one point he was waving very frantically at a group, and he was getting a rather cold reception until he was finally told that because of his nearsightedness, he was waving frantically at a herd of cows. No wonder that he didn't get a response. But I think somewhere there's something that we can learn from that somehow recreating those feelings. He said that fellow feeling. What is fellow feeling that we have for our fellow American citizens? It's an empathy. It's an understanding. It's the human quality we need to listen to other people, to empathize with people for whom fate may have dealt an unkind hand like for us, and to be able to, in a certain sense, just understand their point of view. And that's what I think we need our leaders to do, to get out of Washington, to get back not only to their own districts, to go to other places. I dream about a public service program, a national service program, where kids from the country could go to kids in the city and spend a year in a common mission that they would be able to fulfill so that they're learning what it's like to live with other people. If there's any way I could feel that could happen. I know we've got pieces of it in the Teacher Corps, and we've got pieces of it in what was the Peace Corps, but there's something about bringing people from different parts of the country together with a common mission for our country. The military does it. No wonder. I remember reading that 75% of the military, of congressmen and senators in like the 50s and the 60s were members of the military. They knew what it was like to have a common military mission, so they knew what it was like to have a national mission, and little wonder we had bipartisanship in those days. So somehow we've got to figure out a way to listen, to empathize, and that's what old Teddy Roosevelt was able to do pretty well.
Can I say, I should also report, Twitter has had a lot of impact on our lives, as we know, but it is the author of one of the greatest things, I think, said in our time, which is that if Mr. Rogers and Doris Goodwin had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And so I want to insist on that. And make
He's my son, really, in fact.
I'm glad you said that.
Make sure Mom's okay. I left my sweater outside. But the speaker talks a lot about narrative and fact, reality. And there's a tendency, a human tendency, to want the past to have been simpler. That's understandable, because our own ambient reality is difficult, because it's our reality, it's the problems of our time. But there was never a once upon a time in American history, and there's not going to be a happily ever after. This is an unfolding job. I don't need to tell you all this. You signed up for it. You put yourselves forward. You put yourself in the arena. You are here to do this, to govern in an imperfect world. And you know that. This country, as we know it right now, is about 56 years old. bear with me. The first actually integrated national election in American history was 1968, 52 years ago. The Immigration and Nationality Act, signed by President Johnson, and the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65, transformed the country. So we are a pretty young nation when you think about the actual electorate. So when you go back there and you realize that in 1968, how did that year go? It began with Tet, which brought Gene McCarthy into the race. It forced Lyndon Johnson out of the race. He gave the speech saying he would not be a candidate on the last Sunday in March in 1968. That same Sunday morning, Martin Luther King preached at the Washington National Cathedral. He quoted Theodore Parker saying, "The arc of a moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." 4 days later, he'd be shot to death outside room 306 at Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The country erupts in riots. 6 weeks after that, Senator Kennedy is killed in Los Angeles. 6 weeks after that, the Chicago Democratic National Convention descends into chaos and violence. And on Election Day, 1968, Richard Nixon wins narrowly over Hubert Humphrey. But George Corley Wallace of Alabama carried 13.5% of the popular vote and 5 states on an explicitly segregationist platform 50 years ago. So let's tap the brakes on nostalgia. 100 years ago, the woman who was second in line to the presidency of the United States could not vote until the 19th Amendment. The Ku Klux Klan was refounded on the Saturday after Thanksgiving in 1915 at Stone Mountain, Georgia, as an anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-black, anti-Catholic institution. 2 to 6 million Klansmen joined. There were 30 members of the House who were members of the Klan, about 10 senators. The governors of 5 states were members of the Klan 100 years ago, Georgia and Texas, also Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon, 100 years ago. The governor of Georgia said we need to build a wall of steel as high as heaven to keep immigrants out. And the 1924 Democratic National Convention went to 103 ballots because there were 347 Klan delegates at Madison Square Garden who would not vote for Al Smith to be the nominee because he was Irish Catholic.
I've got to take you to a more hopeful moment. Oh,
But-
wait. You're my son. You're supposed to be.
Sorry, yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Won't you be my mother?
Once you look
FDR.
just think, for example, you look at a decade like the 60s, and you know how it ended, as I said before, and you feel sad about that decade. Extraordinary things happened in that decade, right? In the middle of that decade, you take Lyndon Johnson comes into power, the man that I knew very well, and for whom I feel still an enormous respect. And I think historians will accord him the respect that he deserves, despite the war in Vietnam, which will always be a stain on his legacy. He comes into that presidency in the middle of that decade after John Kennedy is killed, and he makes civil rights, the passage of that bill, his first priority. And his advisors say, you can't do that. You can't do that. You only have a certain amount of currency as president, so you can't spend it on this. And he famously said, and what the hell is the presidency for? And then he somehow, with the civil rights movement having given him the strength to do it, he gets that civil rights bill through the Congress. And that changes the face of America. Segregation is ended legally in the South. And then they think they have to have another year before they can get voting rights because they have to absorb the civil rights thing. And then the Selma demonstrations take place. This is how change takes place in this country. When an outside movement creates the social conscience and changes public sentiment, then the inside channels of power have to mobilize at that moment. That speech that he gave to the joint session of Congress, I was listening to that speech when I was a Harvard student, and there was Lyndon Johnson, who I was in the anti-war movement, who later I would think I could never have been for, and then eventually ended up working for him. There was Lyndon Johnson talking about the fact that he said, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. You know, at times history and fate meet at a certain time at a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. He understood that what John Lewis and the fellow foot soldiers had done in that bridge by turning their backs against a brutal attack against them, that the consciousness of the country had been changed, and it was time to move for that. And then he went on to say that this is not a Negro movement, not a white movement, not a Northern movement, not a Southern movement. It is not a moral challenge because it is simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans the right to vote. And then he went on famously to say, and even if we do that, there's still a long way to go, but if we work together, we shall overcome. The outside movement meets the inside power, and change took place. And at that same time, in those same months, you get Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, NPR, PBS. So we have to remember that in those hard moments, that decade, we look at it and we think, oh my God, it ended the way you said. But in the middle, all of that happened. And I must say, just on a personal note, if I'd ever imagined, as I was listening to that speech with my friends, and we were all in tears by the end of that We Shall Overcome speech, that I'd end up 3 years later working for Lyndon Johnson, or more importantly, that 10 years later, I would meet the man, Richard Goodwin, who crafted those words, and that he would become my husband of 42 years before he died a couple years ago. So that moment means so much to our country. It was the crowning moment of Lyndon Johnson's life, of my husband's life, and I think even though you're absolutely right, my son, in understanding that these things have been really difficult, we have to remember those moments in time when things worked. Because otherwise, that's our responsibility as historians, to tell us where things were tough, but to always tell us how people stood up and we can do it again. Because otherwise, you got to believe we can. We have to believe we can't allow ourselves to not feel that sense of agency that we still have to make these things different, I think.
Absolutely. And the way the 20s ended, with terrible economic depression, but Franklin Roosevelt.
Right. FDR comes along.
Who says on the East Front, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
There's hope in history.
There is hope in history, absolutely. There's also fear, and that's what life is. And we have to remind ourselves, the story we have to tell ourselves is that we can overcome.
Right. Exactly right.
And FDR, because when he came in, it was pretty shaky then, right?
Yeah, and just think about FDR and what he faced when he came in. I mean, he said he was possibly thought in February, before March, that the whole House of Cards might collapse before he could even take the inaugural oath. And somebody said to him, if your new program works, you will be the greatest president in history. If it doesn't work, you'll be the worst president in history. He said, no, if it doesn't work, I'll be the last president in history. That's how fragile things were. And then somehow he gets to that inaugural, and it's not just the fear, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. What he does is to tell the people, this is not your fault what's happened. It's been a failure of leadership, and I'm here to provide that leadership. I will treat this as if we were at a war against a common enemy. This is what I wished had happened with COVID, that it was a common enemy that we should have been at war against as a whole people. And he said that I will do whatever's necessary.